Today let's take a look over the fanciest guns in 10th edition with every single weapon keyword in the game explained. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking weapon keywords in Warhammer 40K 10th edition, going through the list of them, talking about roughly how they work and what they might encourage practically within the game. This video is going to look fairly exclusively just at the weapon keywords and talk through the list. It is kind of part 5 of my How to Play Warhammer 40k 10th edition series, which I'll link down in the video description below. So far in that series we've talked through what you need to play the game, the command movement and shooting phases, and now I thought it was a good time to cover the weapon keywords, given that they're so relevant to really quite a lot of attacks for different models. Weapon keywords in Warhammer 40k are a bit of a new innovation of 10th. A lot of these rules have existed in various different forms, but often either written out on datasheets or at weird places in the core rules. Generally for weapons in the game they tend to follow the weapon name, as you can see on the bolt rifle profile here, which is listed as both assault and heavy. They can apply to both shooting attacks and melee attacks, and just generally slightly alter the way that those attacks apply to enemy targets in games, or what your unit can do before making them. In this video we'll talk through the list in turn, talk through each weapon keyword, give an example of how it might apply, and what it might encourage for your unit with that weapon with the keyword. First up we have Assault, which is a bit rarer of a keyword in 10th edition than it was in 9th. Assault weapons are nice and simple, you get to fire them even if you're advanced, and unlike in 9th edition you don't have a -1 to your hit roll penalty if you happen to advance and then shoot them. One example might be the standard Intercessor bolt rifle here. That one's got both assault and heavy. Means that your Intercessor will be able to move and advance and then still make 2 shots out to 24-inch range with the gun, hitting on normal profile. Generally it does make the units that have it a lot more mobile. Provided they don't want to charge, it basically means that you can just have a free extra d6-inch movement every single time you move around, though sometimes there might be other incentives not to do so, like this bolt rifle also having heavy, so you also get a benefit if you stay still as well. It's definitely a very powerful keyword to have for your gun, as otherwise without it you're looking at trading off either shooting your weapons or advancing and getting the extra movement, which sometimes you might need to do anyway to get to objectives perhaps. Next up we've got the Rapid Fire keyword. This one works by giving you extra shots within half range of your weapon. The keyword's written as Rapid Fire and then a number after it. You take the number that's after it and you add it to the attack's profile, provided you're within half range of the enemy. A lot of rapid fire weapons are small arms, but often they're really quite big guns as well now. For example, the rapid fire battle cannon on the Imperial Knights. At longer range that'll get just d6 plus 3 shots, which is still very nice. But then if you happen to be within 36-inch range of your foe, essentially you'll be getting 2d6 plus 6 shots as you add in the extra rapid fire number. A lot of the times it's double, but not always. For example, Orc Daka weapons, they tend to have rapid fire numbers that are lower than just double the shots. And in general for the units that have it, it will incentivize them getting within half range to deal maximum damage, but still allows them to chip in just a little bit at longer range targets. They'll generally be a lot more dangerous at closer range than longer range though, so if they do have good damage dealing weapons, then it could often be worth trying to either move them closer or deliver them out of a transport or reserves or something to get them within half range. Next up we've got Ignores Cover, which is nice and simple. Lots of units in 40k can get the benefit of cover in terrain, which we'll talk about later in the How to Play series, and typically the benefit of cover will give you +1 to your armor saving throw, so it's really quite nice to ignore it as your opponents will fail more saves. Cover is actually surprisingly easy to come by in 10th edition, with things like ruins partially obscuring units far behind them still granting you cover, so guns that ignore it will be pretty handy. One example is this Purifying Flame cast by the Grey Knight here. If you didn't have the keyword, then the Orc War Boss will get the benefit of cover and the +1 to their save due to this wall partially obscuring him. Without it though, he'll just be saving on his regular armor save or an invulnerable save if he had one, the armor save modified by the AP -1. Twin Linked is a rule that's kind of been resurrected from older versions of Warhammer 40k. Lots of models equipped with either dual guns or dual close combat weapons will now have this rule instead of getting double the shots, though it's maybe a rule that's applied more in some places than others. When you attack the foe with a twin linked weapon, you just make the number of attacks as per the normal attacks that you get on the gun, but you get to re-roll the wound roll with the weapon, so the shots that hit are going to be far more reliable to actually make your opponent test a save. For example, these aggressors have Auto Bolt Storm Gauntlets and Power Fist in combat. Both of those profiles are twin linked. They'll make the number of attacks listed on the profile, and if they fail the wound roll, then they get to re-roll it. As for in-game impact, generally this will be flat worse than just having 2 copies of the same gun without twin linked, and twin linked weapons will generally be a little bit more useful against things that you might have struggled to wound anyway. Far more impactful if you're wounding on a 5+ compared with wounding on a 2. It can interact kind of weirdly with certain other rules as well. Say for example devastating wounds, you could potentially use it to fish for mortal wounds on 6s. Sometimes that might make sense. You do get to reroll any of the wound rolls, not just failed ones should you want to. So if it was absolutely critical that you just needed the mortal wounds out of the devastating wound output, you could reroll everything that wasn't a 6. We'll get to devastating wounds in a second though. Pistols are generally sidearms in 40k, often tend to be not the biggest and most exciting guns, though occasionally it does apply to some unusual stuff. Pistols often tend to work as an alternative style of shooting compared with what your model might normally attack with. If you have pistols on your datasheet, each model has the choice of attacking with any normal ranged weapons that it has, or choosing any pistols instead. You can't usually fire both a normal ranged weapon and also a pistol, unless you happen to be a monster or vehicle. Say for example, a Space Marine Intercessor would either have the choice of attacking with its bolt rifle, or passing that up and attacking with a pistol. For the most part, that kind of unit is generally going to have lower damage output striking with the pistol, but the reason that you'd want to is usually because you're in engagement range with the enemy, you're in combat with them. That would usually stop you making shooting attacks with things like infantry, but pistols have the rule that they can be fired in combat, attacking the unit that you're in engagement range with. Say for example, if you had a Space Marine in combat with this Orc unit here, if it came to the Space Marine player's shooting phase, you wouldn't be able to attack with any other weapons that were in combat, but you would be able to attack with any pistols the models were armed with, so you could just blaze away with your bolt pistols and hopefully inflict a casualty or two. It's definitely nice for ongoing combats, though occasionally just can be a little bit more on the niche side. It does kind of require that say your opponent's chosen to charge you or not fall back, plus neither models have killed each other for you to be able to fire pistols. Pistols are also relevant for that big guns never tire rule that we talked about in the last video. For big guns never tire, they ignore the -1 to hit penalty, so it can be quite nice to fire in and out of combat with big vehicles and monsters. Sometimes that's relevant, like with Melta Inferno pistols. Torrent rules are basically the flame weapons of Warhammer 40k for the most part. These ones are nice and simple and just don't need to roll to hit. Every attack that they land just auto hits the enemy, so their ballistic skills usually listed as not applicable. Say for example if Helldrake attacks with its Baleflamer, it gets d6 plus 3 rolls, so a dice roll plus 3. All of those attacks just auto hit whatever it attacked, and then you roll to wound at the strength 6 profile versus the enemy's toughness. Often torrent weapons tend to have a fairly short range, but they can be particularly effective against things that might have a -1 to hit, like the stealth rule baked in, and particularly if you happen to be firing Overwatch as well. That's a stratagem that you can use to react to enemy movement and then shoot your unit in their turn. Usually you hit on 6s, but if your attacks have the torrent keyword, they just automatically hit, so it means that flamers and things can be particularly nasty for Overwatch. Next up, we've got perhaps one of the more common damage boosts of 10th edition, which is lethal hits. This one's quite a nice damage boost against tough stuff, and the keyword means that every single time you make a hit roll of a 6 to hit the target, that counts as a critical hit, and then that attack will auto wound the enemy, though I would note that it doesn't count as a critical wound, which could be useful for other interactions. Quite a lot of the time it can just be listed on the weapon's profile, such as this Great Unclean One's Bile Blade here. Every hit roll of a 6 will auto wound the enemy there with that AP -2 and damage 2 profile. Or you might have it given to your units by an army-wide special rule or a character, say a Space Marine Lieutenant or the Imperial Guard Born Soldiers rule. For in-game impact, it tends to be a lot better against really tough things, as skipping the wound roll is far more powerful if you are only wounding on a 5 or 6. It's pretty excellent for allowing small and medium firepower to punch up against really tough things that they would have been wounding badly. In terms of interactions as well, I'd also bear in mind that it doesn't stack with sustained hits. We'll get to that in just a second, but that's extra hits on 6s. Those extra hits won't count as lethal hits if you happen to have both. It is quite a nice rule to have though. Lethal hits means that your units tend to be at least somewhat effective against just about everything in the game. Next up we've got the Lance rule, which is a purely close combat one. This one usually represents cavalry lances and things, but it can also be given out to other units that just hit extra hard on the charge. Basically with this one, if you're attacking combat, if a unit has made a charge move in that turn, then you get to add +1 to the wound roll. A nice positive modifier here that again will really allow you to punch up hard against tough units. For example, here we have an Astra Militarum Rough Riders Hunting Lance. He gets to attack with his choice of 2 different profiles. He could just make a single attack with a Melta Tip Lance, Strength 9, AP 4 and Damage D6. If he was wounding, say, a Toughness 12 Land Raider on a 5+ with that would go up to a 4+ with the +1 to wound if he'd happened to make a charge. Definitely quite a nice rule, that one, and obviously it's a big incentive to make sure that your combat unit is charging the enemy rather than the other way around, as their damage will be worse. Next up we've got barrage and artillery weapons with Indirect Fire. The main rule for indirect fire is that you're allowed to shoot even units that you can't make line of sight to, but if you choose to do that, then your damage output will be lower, the hit roll gets a -1 to it, and the target automatically gets the benefit of cover against that attack. If you can see your target, even if it is an indirect fire weapon, then that doesn't apply, so you could just shoot with the normal profile and you wouldn't be automatically -1 to hit. For example, this Plague Burst Mortar wants to fire at the Space Marine Tactical Squad. That's got indirect fire, so you'd get your d6 plus 3 attacks, usually hitting on a 3+, but if it couldn't see them because they were behind a ruin, you'd normally hit on 4s, and if it mattered to their saving throw at all, they would also have the benefit of cover as well, kind of cancelling out the AP -1 of the Plague Burst Mortar here. They'd still be saving on 3s. Indirect fire is often charged at a bit of a premium, as being able to hit literally anything is really quite a big deal. If you've got efficient options for it, it's often worth having just a little bit of it. It often comes in big use, just trying to plink the last couple of wounds off an injured unit that your opponents managed to hide, or just take down the last couple of infantry holding a critical objective, and meaning that they don't score as many victory points. The precision keyword is kind of the sniper one for Warhammer 40k 10th edition. It often tends to apply to sniper rifles, though also some other fun things like unit champions, or in this case an old weird boy psychic power that makes the enemy HQ's head explode. This only has any use if you're attacking an enemy unit with an attached character in it. It doesn't have any impact on lone operative. If you do attack such a unit with a precision weapon though, and provided you can actually see the character model that you want to try and hurt, you can force your opponent to allocate that attack to the character model as opposed to the unit. If you did attack such a unit with Edbanger here, then you'd roll to hit and wound against the unit's overall toughness, and then the enemy character will be making their save against that AP -3 and inflict the damage on them if they failed. If you get enough of it, it does have the potential for sniping out some very powerful characters hiding in squads that would normally be safe. Killing a key buffing character could be kind of massive and might not all be that hard depending on their defensive profile. It does mean that your opponent might think ahead though a bit and try and hide them from line of sight, so you can't just snipe them dead. Next up, we've got the blast keyword, things with high explosives that tend to have an effect on quite a lot of infantry if you fire at them. Blast weapons tend to have random numbers of shots, like this battle cannon with d6 plus 3 attacks, and then when you're determining how many attacks a blast weapon has, it gets to add 1 to the number of attacks for every 5 models in the enemy unit that you're targeting. Say for example, if the battle cannon targeted a unit that had 10 models in it, it would get d6 plus 3 attacks, so usually somewhere between 4 and 9, but then you'd also add 2 extra attacks to that due to the 10 models in the unit, as you've got 2 complete sets of 5. It does mean that blast weapons can be just massively strong against really big units, say 20 strong squads. You could be having an extra 4 attacks per blast weapon attacked at that unit. Blast weapons do have a bit of a downside when they're mounted on big tanks that might want to fire into an engagement range though. Basically due to having high explosives, normally they can never normally be targeted against a unit that you're in engagement range with. So say if your Lehman Russ battle tank was in combat, they wouldn't be able to shoot the actual battle cannon at the unit that was in combat with them. It would have to fire elsewhere as per the big guns never tire special rule. In general, that's not really the end of the world, but it might mean that just some of these tanks aren't quite as efficient at clearing out the models that they're in combat with. Overall, it's definitely quite a nice weapon keyword to have, and does mean that opponents might be a little bit nervous about building up their squads to excessive amounts of infantry, as otherwise blasts are going to go through them very easily indeed. Next up, we've got the Melta keyword. Traditionally, these tend to be anti-tank weapons and tend to have really quite high damage outputs. Often they get a fair amount just on their base number, but if you can get the Melta weapon within half range of the enemy target, then they get to add a number to their damage output on top of that. For example, this Melta rifle carried by the Eradicator gets Melta 2. That means that outside of 9 inches, it'll get d6 damage if it gets a wound through on the target. If it's within 9 inches, it'll get a pretty scary d6 plus 2, potentially all the way up to 8 wounds if you roll well. In general, this just means that they have pretty massively excessive damage against tanks and vehicles, so it does make you incentivized to go after those sort of things with Melta weapons. That damage buff is pretty serious as well, usually over an extra 50% to your output against those kind of targets, so if you can get them within range, it's definitely worth it. Melta weapons are maybe just a bit harder to deliver to that kind of range in 10th edition though. A lot of their ranges went down, meaning that you need to get them within 9 inches. Not quite as easy to do as it was before, compared with say multi-melters coming out of reserve. Next up, we've got the heavy keyword, again another one on that Melta rifle. Heavy is a keyword that's applied a lot more sparingly in 10th edition than it was in 9th, and now it's generally a bit of a positive thing to have for the gun rather than a negative. It means that if you're stationary, you get to add +1 to your hit roll, and if you didn't remain stationary, then you just get to fire on your normal ballistic skill. For example, if that Eradicator chose not to move and just fired that Melta rifle, it would usually hit on a 2+, so a decent amount more reliable if you can afford to remain still. Heavy weapons often do vary a bit between squads and vehicles. Often squads might have a worse ballistic skill for weapons that they have as heavy. Say for example, added heavy bolter within an Imperial Guard infantry squad, that will be hitting on 5s when the squad usually hits on 4s, and basically you kind of need the heavy keywords to just get them back to hitting normally. For certain big tanks and vehicles though, it can just be a positive buff, hitting on their faction's normal ballistic skill and then getting a +1 to the hit roll. Overall, I think it gives you an interesting choice each time you have the unit. Can you afford to sit still and get the extra damage, or does the movement still outweigh that for getting line of sight or towards an objective or something? Plus it maybe just gives you a bit more incentive to try and set them up in a place where they've got good lines of sight to start with. Hazardous is arguably the single most negative keyword out of any of these, as it's not really one that you want to have on your weapons if you could avoid it. It's usually applied to things like plasma weapons and certain dangerous psychic powers where you've got the chance to actually deal damage to your own model as well as the enemy. Often hazardous weapons might have two different choices of attack mode, either a dangerous supercharged mode like this plasma incinerator, or you could just fire it on safe mode, which doesn't have the risk of causing yourself damage but also is far less damage against the enemy as well. If you choose the hazardous mode, then you get to make the attack profile as you would normally, and then after you've made the attack you need to make a hazardous check to see whether or not you're causing yourself damage. You need to make one test for each hazardous weapon that was used, so say if you had a tank with 3 plasma guns on it, you might need to make 3 hazardous checks. For each one that you make, you roll a dice, and for each roll of a 1, either one model in the unit with a hazardous weapon is slain, or if the thing that's rolling is either a character monster or vehicle with big multi-wounds, it instead suffers 3 mortal wounds instead. Really quite a big risk there, particularly if you're low on health and that's actually the difference between life and death. Often it's still definitely going to be well worth still using the hazardous profile though and overcharging your plasma. It's perhaps not quite as brutal as it used to be in 9th edition where every 1 to hit would slay a model. It's now just 1 dice rolled per gun, so big multi-shot plasma weapons don't give you more chance of dying. And in 10th edition the command reroll stratagem also says that you can use it for hazardous checks, so if you've got a stratagem spare then you could potentially reroll that dice if it's absolutely critical. In practice for these, it means that you basically have a choice of risking extra damage versus getting extra damage against your opponent. The way that the weapon profiles are set up, I think that it's usually worth it, but just worth avoiding if the damage output just isn't that meaningful, or if the undercharge profile is still going to be pretty much the same sort of efficiency against what you're trying to kill. Next up, we've got Devastating Wounds, which is a very nice weapon keyword to have, as this one gives you the chance for some nice mortal wounds on your target, very general purpose. Weapons that have devastating wounds like this assault cannon generally want to roll a 6 to wound, as that generates a critical wound, and critical wounds against your target convert their damage output into mortal wounds and then the attack sequence ends. Mortal wounds just generally ignore saves, so usually they're going to be superior. It means that they'll cut through both armor saves and invulnerable saves, though your opponent still might get some feel no pains. Say this assault cannon was targeting an enemy Chaos Rhino and it needed to wound on a 5+. If it rolled 2 6s and 2 5s for the wound roll, each of those 2 6s will convert to 1 single mortal wound as its damage 1. They'd go straight through, and then your opponent would need to make 2 armor saves for the 5s. That would just be on AP 0. Generally this is rarely going to be a bad keyword to have. It gives the weapons that have it a bit more of a bias against really tough stuff with good saves, and it's particularly brutal whenever you convert one with a multi-damage weapon, as that could overspill to multiple different enemy infantry or something, maybe wiping out an entire squad with 1 lucky 6. Next up, we've got another one of the fairly common damage buffs of 10th edition, which is Sustained Hits. This is the one where critical hits get you an extra number of attacks dependent on the profile. Often just Sustained Hits 1, so that would mean that every time you get a hit roll of a 6, you'd get to make 1 additional wound roll on the target. For Lilith Hesperax's blades here, she's got Sustained Hits 2 on them, so every time she rolls a 6 to hit with this big 8 attack profile, that 6 would cause an extra 2 hits on the target, as well as the standard one. Pretty nice, and will mean that 6s are going to be quite a big deal for these units. Again, it's quite a common rule that's often on things like anti-infantry weapons, and is often given out with various different detachment boosts as well. For the most part, this one just equates to pretty much just flat extra damage to your units. Sustained hits are pretty much equally effective against anything that they're attacking against. You just get simply more wound rolls, so it's good if you're either anti-tank or anti-infantry. It does perhaps make the guns a bit more all or nothing though. If you look out and roll a bunch of 6s, you've done great. You might well roll none though. Extra attacks is another combat one, as we'll talk about in the charge and fight phase videos when we get to them. Unlike with ranged weapons, you can generally only choose one melee weapon to strike with in combat. Lots of models only have one combat weapon that they can choose to attack with, though some might have two with, say, a sweep or a strike profile. A fair few models have different things that can also make extra attacks on their models though, maybe things like cavalry hooves, or perhaps they might have a primary weapon that makes the majority of their attacks, and then they follow up with a second one in the other hand. For example, the Great Unclean One might make most of its attacks with that great big bell, and then also it will get an extra 3 attacks with the Bile Blade, hitting at weapon skill 2+, strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2. Just means that you can have a model fighting with multiple different attack profiles at the same time, so they're a bit more of a multi-threat unit. Often the extra attacks tend to be a little bit weaker in nature and perhaps a bit more focused on anti-infantry, though obviously it varies from model to model. Otherwise they're pretty similar to the others, you just can't modify the number of attacks with them with other rules, so say if the Great Unclean One got +1 attack from somewhere, it would only affect the primary weapon that is fighting within combat. Finally, last but not least, we have the anti keyword. This one's to denote weapons that are just particularly good at killing one type of target. The way they work is that you have anti, and then it might be anti-infantry, anti-vehicle, or anti-monster or something like that, and they'll be better against units with that keyword. When an anti-weapon makes an attack, it will also have a dice value listed on it. Say for example, this Haywire Blaster has got anti-vehicle 4+. That means that every time you roll a 4+ to wound, that attack will automatically wound the target as it transfers to a critical wound. It means that, say, a wound roll of basically a 4 or a 5 will basically count as a wound roll of a 6. It means that even though this thing has only got strength 3, so would normally wound a Land Raider on just a 6, it'll actually wound the Land Raider on a 4+, as it's famously good at killing tanks. That can be quite effective just in itself. It will mean that you'll get a lot more wounds against the target that your gun's good against, but it can also stack with other rules as well. Say for example, Devastating Wounds. The Haywire Blaster has also got that. Devastating Wounds means that critical wounds will become mortal wounds, and the anti-keyword means that the successful wounds on that value will become critical wounds. It means this Haywire Blaster is just very dangerous against vehicles, as it means that every wound roll of a 4+ will mean that you get 3 mortal wounds on the target, going through any armor or invulnerable saves against vehicles. Really quite nice, and Games Workshop does decide to combine those keywords on a fair few things that they just want their units to be very, very threatening against. So anyway, there's a bit of a breakdown of some of the most common weapon keywords in 40k 10th edition. There are a few others that are scattered around the individual datasheets, but generally they'll be described how they work on the actual unit rules themselves. You might get a few common ones like the one-shot weapon, which means that you only get to attack with it once per game, say like if it's a single-shot missile. In any case, let me know what you think down in the comments below, and feel free to check out the rest of my How to Play Warhammer 40k 10th edition playlist. I will link that down in the video description. I'll hopefully be along to follow it up with a charge phase video sometime in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics is supported via a Patreon page. If you have been finding any of these interesting or useful, any support is enormously appreciated, keeping the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.